Well, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. Welcome to Valuecast. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that's been, I suppose, been going around for quite a while, but it's coming up in discussions that I'm having personally with buyers, and I know these two gentlemen also having with buyers, which is around contingent workforce management, not specifically the products, the services, but more where's the evolution internally? Who should take ownership of a program? Where does it go in the future? What's the best path? And they're questions that keep coming up in a lot of debates. So, well, why not? Let's get two experts who know this topic really well. Two people who I really trust, and I trust their knowledge, but I also trust them as people. So, before we get into the topic, Mickey, Karl, good to see you.
And you?
Yeah, great to see you. Great to be here.
Indeed. Why don't you just give? I know a lot of people know you, but I'm sure hopefully there's some that don't know you. So, Mickey, do you want to give us a little run through of what you do and who you are?
Yeah, I'm Mickey Pelletier. I'm the CEO and founder of CWM Strategies, independent consulting firm focused on helping client-side contingent workforce programs figure out what it is they want to be when they grow up, essentially helping them figure out their strategy, determining where to go, but then also helping them execute on that strategy. I also support providers of contingent workforce services, helping them right-size their services to better meet the needs of their clients.
Nice one. And you've got absolutely loads and loads of client side experience. You could probably list a few big names that you've worked for.
I was the head of strategy for Meta's contingent workforce program. I also led Zillow's contingent workforce program. I was a consultant over at Accenture, helping internally and externally there. And also was with Kelly OCG and Allegis in the past on the MSP side, and then spent some time over at SAP. So pride myself on having the technology, the MSP, the consulting, and then the client side experience as well.
Yeah, far more than I've had from that side. So it's great to have you on. Karl, what about you? We've obviously
I'm not quite sure how I follow that, because he's just reeled off a whole bunch of names that clearly stand out there, the Accentures of this world and stuff, but I'll do my best. So Karl Whelpdale, I've been in this industry for the best part of 30 years. I have played on both sides of the fence. I started out in the solutions business. Mickey, similar to Mickey, I've worked with companies like Kelly OCG, started my life back in the Adecco days. I think I sold my first MSP program in 1998 when we were using spreadsheets as opposed to the advent of VMS back in those days. So worked all the way through all of that side, eventually jumped over to the dark side, went into procurement. I've spent most of my last 15 years or so working in key procurement roles with people like Citigroup and Mars. Very passionate about how contingent workforce has evolved over the last 20 years or so, as you'll see from some of the stuff that we talked through today, and where it's heading to, and how we as professionals can really link in with service providers for procurement to get the most out of those relationships. Alex, you and I did a podcast on that just recently, to better service the whole enterprise. And I think what we're going to talk about today is of great interest in seeing how this thing has evolved and what's the next evolution. And Mickey's a great partner to share this call with and share that discussion.
I just wish I had as nice of an accent as you two. I just people are gonna say, "Oh, look at those two guys; they're really charming." Oh, that balding gentleman, he's okay.
I wouldn't say that, especially when you listen yourself back on these things.
Nah, it's all good. I tease.
Great. Wow, look at that. Two extremely experienced people with very varied experience across very large clients, supplier side as well as client side. And I'm really looking forward to this chat. So let's get into it. So again, contingent workforce management. Why is it important, do you think, just to highlight the evolution of where we've got to, and also where you think the management of programs could go? I don't know which one of you wants to start off.
Karl, you go ahead. You were there way back in the day. Yeah, so I'd love to.
Oh, okay. Let's have a pop at the older guy. I think it's important, to understand where you've come from in order to establish where you're going to. I think that's a key thing. And so hopefully, we can get into that in the next minute, Alex, is that we've seen this industry evolve and grow so fast and into such a wide industry now, into the trillions of dollars of spend that are now being spent in the future and contingent labor, external workforce, that it's a very apt question. It's a question, as you say, that keeps coming up. And historically, we know that largely procurement, people in my position have led the way with this particular category. And I think we're reaching the crossroads now of where this thing is becoming so integrated and so integral to how an organization functions that it's a question that needs to be asked. And you're right, it's being asked in various forums. There's no one size fits all. I'm sure Mickey would agree with that in terms of what the approach is. And you're right, we're not talking about specific solutions, but what we're talking about here is that there's a point now where it's such of importance to how a company grows and evolves that it's a question that needs to be addressed. So I think that's for me as well. Let's look at the past, and then how do we look into what the future is going to look like? Yeah,
and the options available from a solutions perspective continues to grow. So it makes it even more complex to know where certain things should fit. So it's definitely good. Look, we've put, well, I say we, but I'm taking credit for something that I haven't done here. So Karl, you've nicely prepared a little slide to help sort of talk through this. Do you want me to bring it up?
Yeah, and Mickey and I can tag team on this. So perhaps if I started off here, Mickey. So so what you're looking at here is, as I've just said, you can see on the right-hand side, just to draw people's attention, just the sort of size of the industry we're looking at now. I was recently at the SAI CWS conference in London, and even it surprised me that we're looking at a $3.2 trillion industry back in 2022, and that's probably approaching $4 trillion, which is 4% of global GDP that is now in that space. What's very interesting is look how much of that is independent contractors. I mean, it's over 50% or thereabouts of that spend, and so that marketplace, that expert economy, is clearly growing tremendously in comparison to if you'd looked at this model, say 5 to 10 years ago. But what I tried to do here, and Mickey and I both obviously looked at this slide, was try and give some a little bit of a walkthrough of where we came from. So I've only gone back to 1999 and just done it in some incremental steps. Procurement was very much the responsible owner going back into that period of time for contingent workforce. And the reason for that was that the primary focus was on savings and supplier consolidation. And procurement departments were best equipped really to manage these tasks due to their infrastructure, their expertise, the negotiating contracts, managing vendor relationships, and driving some of those cost efficiencies. And that main focus was supplier consolidation and optimization. And the perceived benefits fundamentally were about transactional cost savings and that simplified management. So it resided very much with procurement. HR wasn't hugely involved. They were aware of this thing being in that side, but because it was seen as being commodity driven and supply chain driven, I don't think there was as enough of awareness at that time as you will start to see as we evolve further down the path. The interesting thing is, it was back in those days that the term total talent acquisition was first coined, and experts were starting to talk about this need for an integrated approach. But as you'll see, as we move through the timeline, it took an awful lot longer to get there than many people.
Here we are 25, 30 years later, still talking about the same thing, right? And we still haven't even achieved how to do that, but I'll let you proceed here.
With different acronyms as well, so.
Yeah, that's fine. And so, yeah, I mean, anything to add on that particular timeline before I move on from there, Mickey?
No, and maybe I can add this later, but it's interesting, this whole timeline. It seems to follow a similar maturity curve of how we think of the progression of contingent workforce programs, of what they've focused on, and as they mature, and it turns from this pure visibility, transaction focus into more strategic items, which, as you articulate here, and we move through into the present. That's where companies are starting to, I think, really change and become more sophisticated. Not only with where the location of their program is, but the things that they're focusing on. So I think that's interesting here. And some of those focuses that are back in the late 90s, early millennium, are still very much things that programs struggle to achieve, that visibility, just being able to get that cost under control, right? Those are still very much top priorities. They're very much part of the things that I talk about, of the value of a contingent workforce program. But we're seeing that evolution, that maturity grow, not only with the location, but with the priorities that companies are going after. So I love this diagram here.
So if we then look at going from there to say 2009 to up to 2019, this is where we start to see this shift in still being procurement led in the early part of that decade. But HR became much more aware of the need that this thing was coming down the pipeline, that if they didn't really have insight into contingent workforce, they were missing 25, 30% of the population that they need to be talking to their businesses. So this shift to HR was also through to the introduction of new talent channels. We start to see new talent channels coming into the fray versus just temporary workforce. And so there was this recognition that there was a real strategic importance of talent, right? The focus of contingent workforce shifted merely from being about managing costs, but also to managing the high quality contingent workers that were driving businesses. And this is where HR has expertise, right? They have expertise in talent management, they have expertise in recruitment, they have expertise in workforce planning, and therefore they started to get more of an evolutionary involvement with procurement and start to partner a bit more than they had done previously. We also started to see the emergence of direct sourcing. And this is where this started to come out. And again, that's now started to become even bigger in terms of percentages that we'll see as we move into the next timeline. But when you look at direct sourcing, it's a fantastic way to start working within this industry. Some people call it a contingent RPO, which is another term that often people will use out in that marketplace. But again, this is a term, a way of sourcing that HR have become much more familiar with, utilizing your brand value, going out to the marketplace, utilizing your own portal websites to actually bring that talent in. And that's why I think we started to see HR much more involved in this time. So some of the benefits really were still around improved compliance, greater control over the contingent workforce spend, but really getting that enhanced agility to be able to meet specific project needs, and getting that workforce flexibility and composition was really starting to become important.
Yeah,
I think it was interesting around this time is, that move to the human focus, the human capital behind it all. We started to see that with the shift, and it's included in the yellow box and near the bottom in the middle there. Talk about that focus on statement of work, right? All of a sudden we realize we have these $1 million contracts with these big consulting firms. Who's on those statements of work? Who's actually performing this work? And how do we categorize that more effectively so we know what we're spending our money on? Again, going back to that cost management, but looking at it through a different lens as we evolve here, because now there is that HR awareness. Suddenly we need to know who these people are, how much we're paying them. Are they on site? What access do they have? What IP do they, are they touching? And I think that bled into the IC risk management as well. This whole concept of being able to protect ourselves, but also make sure we're paying what we think is fair, and the work is being done in a way. And maybe we need to start managing that a little bit more effectively. This isn't just a transaction procurement focus. This is people and humans that we're working with. We need to change the lens that we're viewing this through.
Yeah, and I'd probably say during that period was a time where, contractors, the shift had changed where contractors, were being, deemed more as part of the actual workforce versus this separate entity outside. So all that compliance and risk and all those additional things that businesses needed to start looking at for all this external workforce, you sort of had to start looking at it in a slightly different lens to your permanent, but still make sure you're capturing it. And I think it was that period as well which started to then bring HR into the fold more versus it just being a transactional approach.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. So just moving into the next slide. So 2019, 2024, this is just a 5-year increment I've added in here to bring us up to date. This is where we start to see some real partnering between HR and procurement. And the reason behind that was this growing complexity of the models in the workforce environment really required that there be much more of a strategic, important approach between HR and procurement, a much more collaborative approach on how they start to approach this versus HR being a little bit on the fringe of what was happening. And their focus on talent acquisition and workforce planning, it really needs to be complemented by procurement's ability to focus on that, the expertise of vendor management and the control and the negotiation and support for these new talent channels that were coming in. We've started to see different models at that particular point. So some of the benefits from these programs at that time started to be much more around enhanced agility and scalability, that strategic alignment with business goals. We start to see things like AI tools coming into the service. I mean, we're not going to talk about specific models, but we're starting to see the use of AI, machine learning tools, the creation of comprehensive talent ecosystems. And so this is where I think you start to get this partnering between HR and procurement starts to be forged on a much more solid base, whereas there was much more of a loose alignment, I think, in that period at that time as well.
Right. I mean, that leads into right where we are now, and we're starting to see this evolution of these talent platforms, freelance management platforms. This idea of flexible work is going beyond, not that it's brand new, but it's going beyond your temp staff. It's going beyond your statement of work. There's this also obviously massive bucket of independent talent that we're starting to see, and it's starting to get integrated in with the rest of that workforce. And again, that goes back to that HR human capital lens that we're looking through. And now it's really being driven more of a partnership between HR and procurement. I think Karl will sort of leads into where we're looking at in the future of the next 10 years or so.
Yeah, and just finally, as I put in that box, as you know, Mickey, you go back to the green box at the beginning of this conversation where total talent was starting to be talked about. It's only now that you're really starting to see in this 2019-24 bracket, companies actually coming out and actually saying, we have a total talent program. There aren't that many of them, but it's taken a long time to develop, right?
And the companies that do have it, it's just within pockets of their business, yes. Right? There's no enterprise-wide thing that we see. And obviously that's the dream, right? I mean, that requires a significant change effort. Not that it's not doable, right? But there's just a lot that has to be factored in when approaching that. But obviously starting with a small pocket of your business is the way to go. And we are starting to see that. And those are the use cases that are helping to build the momentum for expansion and leading into that final box of this approach that we're talking about.
So as you can see, this journey, what we've started out with, Alex, on the far left is very much a tactical management process in terms of how we've attacked this. We're now moving much more through the strategic leadership. And so what we try to do here is give a view of, what do the next 10 years look like? And that's where we're going to lead into as we start to talk about why this probably should no longer reside with any single business function. And what we're looking at here is really a multifunctional integrated approach. You're going to see the likes of procurement and HR and IT and finance and legal really having to come together to bring that expertise to bear around a much more complex type of program, but the one that requires all of their expertise and capabilities in the longer run to deliver the overall value to the organization. And that's without the selection of whatever external service provider that you're actually going to start to need to help deploy that, whether it be the VMSs, the MSPs, or anything else. Operations will also really start to get much more involved in this, because operations will start to share that responsibility of how they're aligning the contingent workforce to those operational needs. And how are they then working with their HR partners to make sure they're feeding that back in terms of what their talent requirements are. And so these lines are really starting to get blurred, as we always knew they would, between permanent recruitment and contingent recruitment from that side, which is where you have HR really needing this holistic view, but with the guidance and support of multifunctional departments who can help them to deliver a long-term value.
Yeah. Is it not, though, that, because technically all of these, you talked about all of those teams and areas, and I remember, back in 2003, 2004, and programs when I worked in the MSP world, I had connections with all of those teams and departments, so everyone was involved in it. It's what you're trying to get to from a point perspective. It's not just, it's more about giving more accountability and more ownership and more sort of team cohesiveness to how a program is managed, because everything was quite siloed in the past, I would say. That people didn't know that they should be taking accountability.
The silo, and I think it's building on the expertise that each group brings in and the priorities that they have. If HR is focused on people and making sure that people are taken care of and we're getting the right people. Procurement's maybe focused more on price and services, right? And then legal's focused on the compliance. Right. IT is potentially focused on just getting people to complete the work. Meanwhile, you have the whole length of your business, the enterprise. They're not necessarily concerned about classifications. They just know they need work completed. Yeah. So how do we create a universal omni-channel approach that has centralization and makes it as easy as possible for someone to get the talent they need to complete the work, right? And so each entity, whether that's HR, procurement, legal, they all have their priorities, the things that they care about, that they're passionate about, that their skill set brings to the table. And so we need to be able to work cohesively to bring those strengths together to really get the best of everybody's priorities, to set those managers up for the best success, to set the enterprise up for the best talent strategy, getting them what they need, best cost, best value, best talent, et cetera. All the things we were talking about in the 90s, right? But still bringing that forward in a very integrated approach. So, I mean, there's a couple different levels. There's the idea of, governance, where a program should sit. There's also like a tech stack that goes into it. There's operations. I think we're still focusing, for the sake of this Valuecast, on the where that program sits. But I think they tie together very well as we continue this evolution of our technology, our operations, and general program governance and setup.
Just to add onto your point, Alex, and one of the reasons you're right, you would have, as a service provider, I experienced the same thing. As a procurement leader, I would be able to draw upon HR and a technology, but they would generally be part of that transformation phase, right? What we're talking about here is, in the longer run, particularly let's look at IT. You've got some really smart AI tools and predictive analytics tools coming in that need to be involved. And that's a continuously moving process, right? Integration of those and upkeep of those, which is why I think IT will have a bigger role, not just in the transformational deployment of these programs, but a key player in the ongoing management and ownership of where these programs continue to evolve. So what happens is, in the past, is yes, they'd all come together as part of a transformational budget to deliver, and then they would move off into their respective roles. They would become stakeholders or users of the service, but procurement would then still be the head on the horse of driving. And as you'll see, as we go into the next slide, I'll let Mickey take the lead on the next slide. This is just too big. There's too much that needs to happen to make this happen. And by collaborating for the full term of the contract and what's required, or the full term of the requirement, it's a much more cohesive program.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know if we...
Yeah.
If we want to pull up that slide, we could articulate a little bit more of what that...
Well, I think we've segued nicely into, what does the future look like? So nicely out. Look at that. You prepared yet another wonderful slide. So let's have a little run through.
Sure. Go ahead, Mickey.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We talk about the future contingent workforce model, and again, we're not sitting here saying, the business or the program should sit in one area or another. We're not going to sit here and tell you the structure of it, but what it needs to be is a cohesive partnership between some of those key groups listed in the yellow: your procurement, your HR, your IT, finance, and legal, all of which have a say in the various parts of a contingent workforce program. So what we've articulated here is sort of the 5 key areas, and there could certainly be more, right? Of the leadership development, the program adoption, your governance and risk, your technology and tools, operational excellence, right? So those various groups of procurement, HR, IT, finance, legal, they likely will have their own viewpoint on what some of those items are. Your quality assurance could mean something different for procurement from what it means to IT or legal. Some may not care about that so much. So it's a way of articulating what your priorities are and what your group can do for each one of those buckets, for each one of those bullet points. So that's the general idea of that. Now, Karl, you use the term head on the horse, right? There essentially needs to be that head on the horse. And we talked about that senior responsible owner. So as we look at that leadership and development, there has to be an owner, right? Now, we could sit here and argue maybe that is HR, maybe that is procurement, but there needs to be a senior responsible owner, the final decision maker, the tiebreaker, when maybe we can't see eye to eye. I mean, that's going to be a critical piece here. We could sit here and say maybe it should be HR, maybe it should be procurement. I think it may vary by your organization and what those priorities are, and also who has the most buy-in, who's willing to sponsor this. Because the idea of having 5 different entities, business groups aligned on one strategic vision typically starts with some level of steering committee, right?
Yeah.
But being able to take that down to task level ownership of a RACI and accountability is a lot more than just a steer co, right? You're becoming this entire entity. This whole center of excellence is the term. We can call it, what did we say, a program office, a PMO. You can call it a lot of different things, Karl. So that's I don't know, just sort of the intro here. Karl, let you give your 2 cents on it as well.
Yeah.
I think you articulate it way better than myself, so I'm interested to hear your spin.
No, it's and let's be honest, Mickey. When we first talked about doing this, I used to be very firmly into the camp of thinking this all has to reside with HR, and I was very much in that position. And I like to have my mind change. I like to be able to do enough research and see into things. And as Mickey was talking about the COE model, as we put it here, I could see that as being a transitional model in terms of the long term. But as you really start to look at the complexity of this, I still think that senior responsible owner should be HR, because it's about talent, and we've talked about total talent acquisition, and I think it needs to be there. But what I've been careful to do here is not to break it. It would have been easy to have done these 5 boxes with HR, procurement, finance, legal. That's not the aim here. What the aim here is to see what has to happen within that environment. And you'll probably find some of these functions crossing over. So within operational excellence, you're going to find procurement having some parts to play with on that side. Clearly, governance and risk is something they would sit. But by breaking this out in terms of what do we need to actually drive a successful program, it really starts to drop out here that once you've got that head on the horse, that SRO, that senior responsible owner, and they've got a full business case to manage, and they've got a steer co and a management board or project board to drive that, it's pulling these resources in for the longer term. They can recognize that we're going to see evolution in each of these areas. And we'll continue to see evolution in each of these areas. And they each touch our individual areas of expertise as business functions. So we have to come together, because talent is the lifeblood of our company. And it's going to be for the future. And if we don't do that, we can't just leave that with one entity.
No, agreed. It's a really interesting concept, really. And I think also we've seen a couple of businesses, not to name names, who have, set up a contingent workforce center of excellence, but actually as its own entity, right? So it doesn't report to HR, it doesn't report to procurement, it reports into, the senior board stakeholder, and actually people are starting to see it as a significant area that needs its own ownership. But to your point, I think it's more about breaking out what's required to run a program. And if in one business procurement manage a specific way and a specific function, different to how another can be, it doesn't matter. It's just about making sure you've got the right people that are dedicated and accountable for making sure they're part of this team to get a successful program in place. I think it's
the other part here is, of course, which we've made a conscious decision to stay away from, which are various external provider models. They would also play a part in this. You're going to have an external provider, whether it be an MSP, a VMS, or freelancer management. They need to know there's an infrastructure within an organization that's fully there, capable to give them the best run at being successful. How do they get set up for success? And by breaking this out in that way, I think it gives them confidence that innovation is going to be driven in the right way. When there's going to be a bump in the road, there's a specific work stream or a team that is dedicated to ensuring that. And for me, program adoption is a major thing within organizations. I've seen that in my own world, where everybody writes a fantastic RFP and we get the business case and everything's going well. And then as you're striding to drive that program adoption, you hit bumps in the road. You hit bumps in stakeholder groups who maybe aren't fully up to speed with what should be going on, or how we're actually going to develop the right training and tools and development and those kind of things. You need a work stream, or you need a group that's focused on reporting up through that senior leadership in terms of these are all the key things that will get us to success. And we've got the right resources internally and externally focused on making sure this happens.
I want to go back on Alex, the point you're making of we're starting to see this center of excellence become its own entity. I mean, if I could advise, that would be ideal. I have this idea of this chief contingent workforce officer, and I've told people that, and they've laughed and said you're crazy. But I don't know, how can 50% of your workforce, who's representing that? If 50% of your workforce is non-employees, boy, I think that requires probably a significant structure to manage that and understand exactly what that workforce consists of, and give you that visibility and that governance and that structure to own and manage it in an effective way. So I'm very keen on that point. I think that's interesting. If it needs to be a head on the horse under HR or under procurement, we do have to fit somewhere into the structure. That's okay. The fact that you're bringing entities together to work in a cohesive fashion with decision-making aligned under a steering committee, with a clear roles, responsibilities, and sometimes they will cross over, right? Communications, well, man, that's very much a part of operational excellence. We're going to have to communicate our governance and risk. What about our technology? A lot of these things are cross-functional. And the thing I always lean back to is, if you're a company just starting out and you don't know what to do, you don't know where to sit, that's okay. Start with a steering committee. If nothing else, have a steering committee of your procurement, HR, IT, finance, legal, the groups that are most invested in contingent workforce to get their viewpoint. You have to start there, and then it trickles down. It builds out from there as you evolve and you understand what works for your business and what doesn't. So I wanted to pick on that one point you said, and then just kind of call out if you're kind of questioning, well, where do we even start? You start with a steer co and help formulate your business case.
That was really, sorry for cutting up. I'm going to take the slide down now, unless you guys want it.
Sure, no, go ahead.
No, please.
Let me just say, I like the title, the job of Chief Contingent Workforce Officer. I think I'm going to start.
Thank you, Karl. Thank you.
That's a job I would like out there somewhere.
Well, I'm sure it could happen, but one of the biggest challenges, and I suppose you started to ebb onto that one a bit, Mickey, is, okay, this is all fantastic, right? I can see.
Sounds great. Sounds delightful.
Sounds delightful. I've got, I'm a large enterprise business. I've got 50% of my workforce is contingent. Everyone is too busy to evolve into such a model. Like, how can you help advise, and how can a business help change? And I know you said, and the reason I'm saying that question now is, one, you said a very good point, which is steerco, right? That is important. But what else? What are those key things that a business has to do? And I know it's a difficult question because it's
because it depends a lot on the priority of the business of your company. What are they really looking to do, and what matters to them? And I mean, your business case obviously always goes back to the data. What's important? Are they most concerned about risk aversion? Are they concerned about cost containment? Are they worried about headcount and talent quality? What are those? And I hate using the term the pain point, but what do they care about most? And building that business case behind it, and what's going to work. I mean, it requires not an awful amount, but a fair amount of analysis to determine what's appropriate. I think it also is right to look at what other, I don't always like advising it, but look at what other companies are doing, at least as a baseline of ideas of what they did and what possibly could work for you. I'll also advise it's not always a bad idea to go and get an outside consultant to help you think about this from an objective third-party point of view. But again, it requires data analysis and finding out the priorities and pain points, and being able to build the business case.
Yeah, I would. I think they're great points. I mean, what we've talked about here today, I suppose to a large degree is the future piece being an evolution of where an organization is currently going to be in a maturity cycle. If they're already having a contingent workforce program, it's kind of where we've gone to. Well, the next stage is, how does that grow? It's not just a case of putting more resources into that program. It's actually a case of how does that. But if you're a smaller organization that perhaps doesn't have one of those programs in place just yet, your path to getting to a solution, it may not actually be this kind of COE model. The size of the volume of your business might not be. I do think, though, to Mickey's point, is that you need to fully, I'm a strong proponent of, you need to really fully map your internal environment, map your internal customer issues, the why, the challenges they're facing in the business. What does your technology landscape look like? What are the supply? Build all that piece together and start to see what the appetite is from the stakeholder community for, if I could deliver this value to you, if I could get you resources much more quickly and effectively and hit the ground running and these areas, and start to pull that together. As a buyer, That would be my first approach of going out there to try and build the need and the pull from the business for, yeah, I can see real value as to why actually this needs to be more of an integrated approach. Because I think businesses and stakeholder groups want to be involved in it, but how can they be involved in it rather than just saying, well, I have to go to procurement or I have to go here. We're trying to propose is building a function that is open for everybody. It's available there as a source of expertise, capability, and a font of knowledge to grow.
Yeah, great. And when I look at the history as well, like businesses in the past, and this has evolved too, right? Businesses in the past have relied heavily on the supply chain to provide that strategy, right? To get into a specific level. But because if you're in a large enterprise business and 50% of your headcount is contingent, you're probably going to have a multitude of suppliers with different agendas that are looking to try and get a specific route. And it's not that they don't obviously want to provide value and work together, but I'm a strong believer that you get to that level from a program perspective, you need to have a much more structured governance in place, whether that is HR or procurement, whatever the value is expected out of the end, the end product, whether it is increasing the quality of talent, if it's cost savings, efficiency, whatever it would be. My one piece of advice is if you're seeing that a provider is providing that strategy, that needs to stop, and you need to turn and actually start to provide that internally yourself. Not that suppliers can't give good advice; they need to be a part of that steer code, but it can't be driven by the supply chain.
No, you're right, and there's always an argument, and I've done it both ways. I've run a steerco that have the suppliers involved in the steerco, and I've run a steerco where they're not. And to be honest, it works better when they're not, but then you have a separate program board where you then have the suppliers in that piece. Because from a decision-making perspective, what you really should be looking at is, because the steerco is there to keep the business case on track, is to make sure are we actually staying and doing what we're going to deliver. And only 5% of decision-making should make itself to a steerco. The next 15% or so should be done at your program board. The remaining 80% should be done within the teams that run those work streams. If everything's going to a program board, and that's why you don't want to supply necessarily within that structure, but you want them to have a right voice at the right level.
Right. They need the appropriate representation in there as well through some type of program management, right? And I know we said the structure of what we're setting up isn't saying to go one way or another, but they should have some level of voice, particularly if you're outsourcing a larger level of service, right? They have their own expertise that perhaps you can borrow, but obviously your mileage may vary based on provider and what your priorities are. Yeah,
agreed. Well, look, we're running close to time, guys, already. I can't believe we've been talking for almost 40 minutes, which is great. But let's try to review what we've gone through. And if you were to give that, you sat there in front of whether finance, HR, procurement, whoever is currently sort of accountable, what would that first piece of advice be to them? Would that be create a steerco, Mickey, or would that be something else?
Analyze where you're at. What are your goals, right? And it's so. What do you do? What's the future? What's the right thing? It really requires looking at the state of the state, where you're at, and what the priorities are, and being able to, I think, aligning yourself with the effective not decision makers, but leadership that can support and back you and align and champion your vision of what you want to do. I think that's just one of the key pieces. And that can be hard to find as a contingent workforce program owner, right? So being able to partner with the right folks that will be your champion and elevate your vision.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. You definitely need to identify who your sponsors are going to be. And what I would go back on that and say is do something that's not too dissimilar from what we've done today. Build your own structure and view as to what your contingent workforce journey's been like within your organization. Go back and say, well, look, here's what we did 10 years ago. We had a preferred supplier lists, and we had X amount of suppliers. We consolidated, we moved. This has been our journey, and here's what the industry is telling us from a research perspective. And here's what they're telling us that the potential models could be. So that's the best way to get people to buy into. We can sit here and talk about what we've experienced. What's that your own journey been? And then what does that lead you to say, well, if this is what it's going to be like in the next 10 years, and we're looking at growing by 30% year on year as a company for the next, well, what's that doing to our workforce? What's that going to do to our needs? We need to sit down and start talking about a solution now. Otherwise, we're going to decrease our ability to attract talent. If you can then create that positive or tension that something needs to be done and then start to pull people in, I think that's a good way to approach it.
I love that idea of storytelling of your history, of
Yeah.
how you got to where you are. That's a great idea.
Yeah, definitely. I 100% agree. And then apply some accountability to it, apply some consistent
Some
approach.
data, real data, absolutely.
And yeah, you know, real data. Brilliant. Well, look, guys, I've really enjoyed chatting to you both. It was quite nice actually for once for me not to do all of the talking. So, you know, fantastic that you were both on here. Thanks for preparing the content. I hope all the people that have been listening and watching to this will find it valuable. Obviously, if you're listening to it, you won't see the slide, but you know, if you get in contact with Karl or Mickey, they'd love to have a chat with you about it anyway. So, brilliant, guys. Thanks ever so much for your time. Speak to you soon.
Thanks for having us.